1883, 135 years before the point of no return, Sir Francis Galton introduced a technique aimed at identifying distinctive traits in people, such as criminals, and determining the common external features that set them apart from others. Galton's approach involved superimposing photographs of several individuals to create an average composite portrait, and thus studying whether certain facial characteristics, such as skull shape or facial structure, were common to those individuals. Today, using modern technology, we can apply a similar technique to create composite portraits of all UFC fighters, competing in both the male and female categories. This process leads us to scrutinize the field of physiognomy, which seeks to relate a person's character to their outward appearance, often focusing on facial features. This endeavor to relate internal traits to external attributes has been a long-standing endeavor throughout human history, although it has had little scientific basis. However, an intriguing discovery emerges. A study conducted in 2014 scrutinized the facial features of 241 UFC competitors, revealing that fighters with broader faces tended to be more formidable adversaries on average. Additionally, a New Scientist article from February 2009 highlighted a resurgence of interest in physiognomy. This revival was supported by research showing a significant correlation between wider facial structures and the frequency of penalty, minutes accrued for aggressive actions against opponents, as observed in a study of 90 hockey players. The emergence and advancement of machine learning techniques for facial analysis have unveiled further insights. Researchers have found that facial characteristics not only hold predictive value for aggression, but also exhibit a 72% accuracy in determining political orientation. Sir Francis Galton, credited with introducing composite portrait technology, boasts an extensive array of accomplishments. He is renowned as a researcher, geographer, anthropologist, sociologist, meteorologist, ontogeneticist, statistician, and pioneer of differential psychology and psychometrics. Interestingly, he is also a cousin of Charles Darwin, leading to a remarkable coincidence where two influential geniuses with profound impacts on human history share genetic kinship. 1944, 74 years to the point of no return, Erwin Schrödinger publishes his popular science book entitled What is Life? The author is known to everyone for the Schrödinger's cat paradox, which he invented simply to ridicule the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. But actually, Erwin Schrödinger is one of the founders of quantum mechanics, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. Surprisingly, Schrödinger, primarily a physicist, delves into biology with this book. In What is Life? He endeavors to elucidate biological phenomena through the lens of physics. Demonstrating his versatility, Schrödinger presents a groundbreaking theoretical proposition within this work, suggesting that the physical medium for hereditary information in living organisms is an aperiodic crystal. That is, it is a molecule that, unlike an ordinary crystal, does not repeat itself. Yes, at that time, there was not yet enough experimental evidence that it was DNA, and it was unclear exactly how the properties of parents are transmitted to their offspring. Schrödinger wrote that the aperiodic nature of this very crystal, the carrier of hereditary information, allows it to encode an infinite number of possibilities, almost with the help of a small number of atoms. Subsequently, Francis Crick substantiated this proposition by elucidating the structure of DNA, an achievement for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. Intriguingly, both Crick and Schrödinger independently acknowledged What is Life as a source of inspiration for their initial inquiries. Despite its intricacy, DNA exhibits remarkable stability, enduring extremes such as boiling temperatures or millennia of burial. The oldest decoded DNA to date dates back approximately 2 million years. DNA serves as the fundamental blueprint of terrestrial life forms, present in all except certain viruses, making it the quintessential code of life on our planet. It governs the evolutionary trajectory of organisms and contains a wealth of information ranging from physical attributes like height, skin color, hair, and eye color to physiological aspects such as muscle function and metabolic rate. Acting like a set of instructions, DNA encodes for proteins, the essential building blocks of the body. Of course, DNA is hardly ever divided into individual fragments, each responsible for a different trait. For example, there is no single gene that determines the length of the nose. But some diseases arise precisely when there is a disorder in one of the genes, such as through mutations. We recognize the huge influence of heredity in the first, second, third, and 10th cases, but that's until we talk about our personality. So we have genetics, which among other things determines the development, structure, and function of the brain. But many people really think that genetics has nothing to do with psychology. This video draws inspiration from the book Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are by American psychologist and geneticist Robert Plomin, which was published in 2018, after more than 3 decades of dedicated work. Plomin is renowned for his contributions to twin studies and behavior genetics and has achieved significant recognition in the field, ranking 71st among the most cited psychologists of the 20th century, according to the Review of General Psychology in 2002. His work has placed him among the 100 most prominent psychologists in the history of science. Despite the book's instant success, certain findings sparked contentious reactions from some American scientists, leading Plomin to depart from the University of Pennsylvania and relocate to England. Your whole idea of your experience, your abilities, ultimately, life in general, this book just takes it and turns it all upside down. Of course, it is up to you to decide what to do with this information, and there are, as usual, many points that many are willing to argue with. Many of you will feel discomfort or even anger as you watch, and some of you may even be relieved. 1961, 57 years to the point of no return. A rare event occurred in a maternity hospital. Monozygotic triplets were born, 3 brothers who were genetic clones of each other, having identical DNA. Upon discovering this, the mother immediately gave them up, which led to their adoption by 3 different families. Remarkably, these families came from different social classes. One twin ended up in a working-class family, another in a middle-class family, and the third became part of a wealthy family. 19 years later, by chance, the brothers learned of each other's existence. Surprisingly, they found striking similarities in their manners, habits, tastes, and temperaments. They even discovered that they were attracted to similar partners, that they bought the same brand of cigarettes, and often uttered the same phrases at the same time. All 3 had diminished eyesight, and what's more, each suffered from mental health issues. Following their adoption, specialists conducted regular visits with the boys, initially occurring at least 4 times a year, and later tapering to once annually as they matured. During these visits, the children underwent cognitive assessments and other evaluations, all of which were meticulously documented on camera. These visits were presented to the adoptive parents as standard practice in adoption procedures. Unbeknownst to the families, the triplets were participants in a scientific inquiry known as the Nature versus Nurture study, overseen by psychiatrist Peter Neubauer. Neubauer aimed to demonstrate the significance of environmental influences in shaping individuals' development. The triplets, Robert, Edward, and David, were not the sole subjects of this research. Numerous others were also involved, though the precise count remains undisclosed. The records of these studies are archived at Yale University, with restricted access until October 25, 2065. The age-old debate of nature versus nurture examines the interplay between genetic predisposition and environmental factors in shaping human destiny, which exerts a stronger influence. The genetic blueprint encoded within your cells or the life experiences you encounter from conception onward? Does one possess the freedom to pursue any path, or are there inherent constraints dictated by one's DNA, present in every cell of the body? In the early 20th century, with the emergence of psychology as a burgeoning field, it was widely believed that individuals were malleable like clay, with their development heavily influenced by upbringing, particularly during childhood. This perspective, championed since Freud's time, emphasized the significant role of upbringing and family in shaping one's identity and characteristics. An alarming consequence of this perspective was the notion of the schizophrenogenic mother, suggesting that a mother's negative behavior towards her child could lead to schizophrenia. Essentially, mothers were blamed for their children's schizophrenia due to perceived lack of attention and warmth. This notion caused significant guilt among many mothers. However, since the 1960s, the idea that environment solely determines outcomes has been challenged, particularly by genetic research. Psychogenetic studies have shown that schizophrenia cannot simply arise in individuals without a genetic predisposition. So, how do we discern genetic diseases from others? Through research involving twins, both identical and divergent, and adopted children, by comparing the likelihood of both types of twins developing the disease simultaneously. We gain insights into the genetic component of various conditions. The influence of environment and upbringing becomes insignificant as siblings are brought up under the same conditions. For example, in the case of schizophrenia, it turns out that if you have a homozygous twin brother suffering from schizophrenia, who is your genetic clone, you yourself will get the disease with a 50% probability. And if you and your brother are heterozygous twins, the risk of getting the disease is no more than 15%. In addition, if you have an adopted brother or sister with schizophrenia with whom you grew up in the same family, or if you were adopted into a family with a brother or sister with schizophrenia, the likelihood of developing the disease is not affected by this relationship. This is true even if you received the same upbringing from the same parents. 1990, 28 years to the point of no return. The year marks the beginning of one of the most ambitious projects in the history of science. The project is called the Human Genome. Its cost is conservatively estimated at $3 billion. Its goal is the complete decoding of human DNA. By 2003, 85% of the genome will have been sequenced. Although we are very different in appearance and personality, about 99% of the 3 billion steps in the DNA sequence are identical for you and me. But at the same time, this means that there are about 30 million steps between us that are different. Anyone would agree with the fact that the environment we are in influences who we are, but few people realize how important the differences in DNA are. The main point that Robert Plomin tries to make in his book, he repeats it probably 100 times, is that the only source of systemic psychological differences between people is not the environment at all. Not your environment at all, but your DNA. Robert Plomin also acknowledges the significance of environmental influences, but he highlights a crucial point. Recent discoveries suggest that environmental influences are often unstable and unpredictable. What this implies is that these influences cannot be reliably measured. For instance, if a person experienced abuse as a child, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will become an abuser themselves in the future. The connection between past experiences and future behavior cannot be determined with consistent accuracy, based solely on environmental factors. One psychologist will tell you that he will because he was beaten. Another will tell you that he definitely won't for the same reason. And both of these versions sound plausible. But things change when we talk about genes. Plomin writes, in fact, to demonstrate that a particular psychological trait is inherited is mauvais, because all psychological traits are inherited. An indication of how much the situation has changed from the doctrine of the importance of nurture from the last century is that I don't know of a single psychological trait that doesn't show genetic influence. For example, consider a child who has been raised by overweight foster parents for many years. How might the eating habits of these foster parents affect the child's own weight? Surprisingly, they may have no effect at all. Studies have shown that there is no correlation between the weight of foster children and the weight of their foster parents. This suggests that differences in the diet and lifestyle of foster parents do not affect the weight of their foster children. Even if foster parents provide nutrition and care, their foster children will not necessarily have the same weight as them. Similarly, if you compare foster and non-adopted children raised in the same family with the same access to nutrition and lifestyle, their body mass index will be significantly different. But with biological parents, the inheritability of weight is from 70 to 80%, even if the child doesn't live with them and has never seen them at all. You don't have to be obese if your parents are overweight. You can even exercise and follow a strict diet, but you will likely have a harder time maintaining your weight than other people. Of course, it's important to remember that these are statistics describing a specific population at a specific time, taking into account a specific combination of genetic factors and environmental influences on that population. This is very important because, for example, the inheritance of body mass is higher in richer countries like the US than in poorer countries, like Albania and Nicaragua. Richer countries have cheap fast food places like McDonald's. In addition, people there make more money and may not limit themselves from eating sugary, fatty, and tasty foods. Indeed, while genetics play a significant role in predisposing individuals to obesity, it's essential to recognize that not everything is solely determined by genetics. The fact that heritability is never close to 100% underscores the importance of environmental factors. Analysis of 45 twin studies revealed that the heritability of weight increases from 40% in early childhood to around 60% in adolescence and up to 80% in adulthood. Moving beyond weight inheritance is an ancient observation that suggests a link between parental divorce and the likelihood of one's own divorce, Statistical evidence supports this notion. One plausible explanation is that children of divorced parents may lack a stable relationship model, leading to subconscious repetition of their parents' scenario in adulthood or developing mental trauma affecting their own relationships. But this is always the case. A recent Swedish adoption study found that the link between parents' divorce and their children's divorce is laid down genetically, not by environmental influences. To find this out, they took 20,000 people who were put up for adoption in their earliest childhood and looked at their marriages and their parents' marriages. Imagine you live in an adoptive family and know nothing about your birth parents. But if your biological parents were to suddenly divorce, you would be much more likely to divorce than if your adoptive parents, who are raising you, were to divorce. The inheritability of divorce is about 40% across all studies. That's a far cry from 100%, which means that non-genetic factors are also important. But the only systematic factor that influences divorce is genetics. Because in studies having established genetic factors, researchers have begun to look at environmental factors that could be the causes of divorce. There must be something that divorce-prone people have in common, besides genetics. For example, the size of the living space, having or not having friends, not liking animals. But it turns out no. Otherwise, everything else is absolutely individual. As we can see, parental divorce is the best and generally the only reliable predictor of child divorce. And this link, which is very easy to explain in terms of environmental influences and upbringing, is actually due to genetics. In other causes of divorce, as Plumman writes, there are no statistics. I want you to understand exactly what is meant. You may have the perfect couple, neither of your parents were divorced, and then a flower pot falls on your partner's head, and he wants a divorce. Yes, it happens, but it's an unpredictable, isolated, haphazard phenomenon with unclear consequences. That's why we say we don't know how the environment affects, although it does somehow. And the second important thing to realize is that there is no divorce gene that makes its possessors hardwired for divorce, just like there are no bad genes that make people bad partners for stable marriages. It's all about genetically determined personality traits. It will seem strange to some, but people who are passionate about life, joyful, emotional, and impulsive are more likely to divorce. Few would argue that these personality traits are inherently negative. In fact, many view them as desirable qualities in a life partner. Brace yourself, as a contentious idea regarding parenting is about to be presented. Robert Plumman contends that despite concerted efforts, there is no empirical evidence supporting the effectiveness of parenting. Research fails to demonstrate a significant impact of upbringing or environmental factors on various personality traits, including conventional ones like extroversion and neuroticism, as well as those seemingly influenced solely by parental upbringing, such as altruism, compassion, and kindness. Even traits traditionally associated with effective parenting, like patience, exhibit similar patterns of moderate heritability and minimal environmental influence. In essence, the research concludes that upbringing doesn't significantly shape a child's disposition towards kindness or harshness. Extensive analysis reveals that familial exposure does not contribute to individual differences between family members. While family members may share psychological traits, it's due to genetics rather than upbringing. Growing up with siblings doesn't make one more similar to them, beyond what DNA dictates. This finding is startling and challenges conventional beliefs. It may be particularly difficult for parents who have invested significant effort into raising their children. However, within the realm of behavioral genetics, this notion has long been an established principle. Researchers have diligently searched for any evidence of substantial environmental influence, but have yet to find any conclusive results. Once you start thinking about how important DNA is, it's hard to point to any psychological experiences completely devoid of possible genetic influence. For example, accidents are not always random. Some children have more accidents than others. Of course, for adults, automobile accidents are not always random either. And here we are on the threshold of the most scandalous topic. Geneticists in the second half of the last century, and to this day, have had a very difficult time. You couldn't take a step without being called a Nazi, and God forbid you should mention the influence of genes on intelligence. As mentioned, Plumman spent 30 years collecting data to write his book. It took him so long because, as you've already realized, most of the sources are multi-year studies of twins. But another reason he candidly admits to is cowardice. For a long time, he says, it was simply dangerous to study the genetic origins of behavioral differences and write about it in scientific journals. I don't know what makes him think it's safe now. Exactly the same people who write Nietzsche off as an ideologue of the Aryan race. Even though he wrote that anti-Semites should be shot, exactly the same people will want to hang Plomin without even reading his works. It should be noted separately, those who may be hit hard by Plomin's works. They are the ones who will scream the loudest about genetic determinism, eugenics, and fascists. 1870, 1 year, 147 years to the point of no return. The great Charles Darwin publishes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which, based on the work of his cousin Francis Galton, he argues that human character traits and mental characteristics are inherited in the same way as physical characteristics, and opposes the distinction between mind and body for the purposes of evolutionary theory. In a section on natural selection in civilized societies, he writes about what would later inspire the United States to introduce forced sterilization programs for certain categories of people. Darwin concludes that natural selection no longer seems to work in civilized societies. A quote, "In savages, those who are weak in body or mind are quickly eliminated, while those who survive usually show good health. On the other hand, we civilized people do our best to stop the process of elimination. We build asylums for the feeble-minded, the crippled, and the sick. We enact laws for the poor, and our medical men do their best to save everyone's life to the last moment. And there is reason to believe that vaccination has saved thousands of people who, because of their weak constitution, would sooner have contracted smallpox. Thus, weak members of civilized societies breed their own kind. No one who has been involved in breeding pets would doubt that it must be extremely harmful to the human race. It is amazing how quickly lack of care or misdirected care leads to degeneration. Except for man himself, hardly anyone is ignorant enough to allow their worst animals to breed." It may sound cynical, but he goes on to write that we must accept this state of affairs because neglecting the weak and sick would be the real evil. Never did Darwin call for the forced sterilization of humans. Even his brother Galton, who was the founder of eugenics, wrote only that the population should simply be educated about genetics and encourage eugenic marriages. Eugenics is the doctrine of selection, as applied to humans and ways to improve their hereditary traits. The doctrine was designed to combat the phenomena of degeneration in the human gene pool. Galton did not call for killing or castrating anyone. He said to do what, for example, is now being done in Singapore. There, people with high intelligence who marry. The state pays for an ocean cruise and gives a large loan for the purchase of housing. Highly educated women who have given birth to 3 or more children write a serious cash bonus. But what does intelligence have to do with it? Isn't it a sociocultural factor? Does genetics play a significant role here too? Let's start with what we call intelligence in general. Well, according to most intelligence researchers, intelligence is the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, understand complex ideas, learn quickly, and convert experience into knowledge. Not the most rigorous definition. There are many types of cognitive abilities such as verbal and spatial, but you are actually more likely to possess one if you have the other. Say, people with higher memorization abilities tend to have higher abilities within all other forms of intelligence. People often think they're good at either literature or math, for example, but in fact they are likely to be good at math if they are good at literature and vice versa, although there are certainly exceptions. Intelligence tests typically include a dozen verbal and nonverbal tests as a total score called an IQ score. It turns out that IQ is the most studied thing in the history of sociology. If a person has an IQ of about 80 or below, world-renowned Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson assures us that there are no ways to teach such a person anything complex that would not be counterproductive. According to Peterson, there are no ways to increase his cognitive abilities yet either, and that's not his fault. The situation with geniuses is mirrored. Their genius in many ways is clearly not everything, but much of it is due to innate potential. Mensa is the largest and oldest society of people with a high IQ. The number of its members exceeds 120,000 people from about 100 countries. However, if you have such a desire, everyone can join it, but only if he is among those 2% of the world's population whose IQ starts from 131 points. If you want to find out your IQ, they have a test on their official website, the link to which I will leave in the description. Socially, intelligence is the best predictor of educational achievement and professional status, and it's strongly inherited. You're going to say, that's where Plomin gets it. IQs below 80 are an absolute minority. But what about those people with higher IQ? Their mental development, level of education, and professional status are obviously linked to the family they were born into. If he is lucky enough to be born into a rich family, he will be hired tutors, put into a private school, and then put in a top manager's chair. Even if the family is not rich, parents can engage in their children, read them books, for example. And indeed, how much parents read to their children correlates with how well children do in school. But as reasonable as these causal interpretations may seem to us, we need to be as certain as we can be about where the cause and the effect are here. For example, we can say that because parents and children are 50% genetically linked, parents who like to read have children who like to read. Another starting point for genetics on this issue is that children who enjoy reading give their parents positive reactions to when their parents read to them, such as listening attentively, asking questions, and being genuinely surprised. And so, parents read to them more often and more. Eventually, children themselves may ask their parents to read to them. The same principles apply to education. Schools are important because they teach basic skills, such as literacy and numeracy, and provide fundamental information about history, science, math, and culture. This is why basic education is compulsory in most countries around the world. But children vary widely in how well they do in school. You'll say it depends on the school, but in fact, according to research, differences in children's school achievement are almost independent of which school they go to. The conclusion that schools don't matter much about children's achievement seems surprising, given how much is said about it. But the fact is that the average differences between schools in the ranking tables mask the main point. Look, there is significant overlap in performance between kids in the best and worst schools. In other words, some kids from the worst schools outperform most kids from the best schools. Many psychologists would be stunned by such a bold conclusion. Karl Popper said that the first commandment of science is that theories are not just testable, but also refutable, and it is very, very easy to refute this conclusion. One need only demonstrate that environmental factors such as upbringing, schooling, or life experience have any statistical influence after controlling for genetics. It is not enough to cite some life incidents. Cases that happen to your relative or neighbor are not enough to demonstrate a statistically significant effect. Plumbing writes, "I am not worried about my findings being disproven because there is a century of research behind them." Do you know why the fact that genetics has a systematic effect size of 50% on average is so surprising? Because, for example, as Plomin writes in Psychology, very few effect sizes reach any meaningful magnitude. For example, it's sort of obvious to many people that boys and girls differ markedly in school performance. But in fact, sex differences account for less than 1% of the variance. In other words, if all you know about a child is whether they are a boy or a girl, then you know next to nothing about their propensity to succeed in school. Another example related to school achievement is classroom size. It is widely believed that children learn better in classrooms that have fewer children in them. The assumption is that more attention is given to each child, and that's true. But guess what effect size we're talking about? 1%. 1982, 36 years to the point of no return. Richard Dawkins publishes his book, The Extended Phenotype, which revolutionizes the human view of gene function. Simply put, phenotype is how a gene manifests itself in the environment. In other words, the phenotype is the organism that genes build around them. Your kidneys, muscles, the color of your hair and eyes, bones and brain are all your phenotype. But Dawkins suggests going even further. The basic idea is that phenotype should not be limited to biological processes such as protein biosynthesis or tissue growth, but should include all the effects that a gene has on the environment directly or indirectly, inside or outside the body of an individual organism. And the more an organism affects its environment, the richer its phenotype. To make it clear how genes in the face of phenotypic manifestations can extend beyond the host organism, here's an example. Flu virus genes manipulate the behavior of a human, a completely different organism, causing it to sneeze and spread the virus. The beaver's genes that encourage it to build dams have an effect on surrounding landscapes up to several square kilometers. Our homes, our livestock, our cars, tools, weapons, everything that results from human activity is an extension of our phenotype. This is how our genes manifest themselves in the environment, influencing it. Because before us all of the above existed in nature in a completely different form. An important phenotype is not only your eyes, but also the glasses you wear, Even interplanetary spaceships that have already left the solar system are all the result of our genes, because everything is ultimately what genes do for the sake of their replication. The 50% heritability of intelligence is just a lifetime average across all studies. Because, for example, skills in reading, math, and science show an even higher heritability, around 70%. But there's something else in all these averages. Here's how you think the impact of heritability, if rises or falls with age. The most intuitive answer is that it falls because the environmental influence on the organism increases. The longer we live, the more we are influenced by parents, friends, relationships, and jobs, as well as accidents and illness. But the bottom line is that environment is not something that happens to you passively. It's something you shape with your actions over the course of your life. Expanded phenotype. Here's no psychological trait that shows less genetic influence with age, but the area in which inheritability increases most dramatically during development is cognitive ability. For example, it is very difficult to detect any differences in childhood in people who are later diagnosed with schizophrenia. It is likely that the genes that contribute to the disorganized thinking, hallucinations, and paranoia characteristic of schizophrenia do not exert their effects until the brain develops to a high level of symbolic thinking in adulthood. In the past, psychologists have suggested that the environment is something we passively victimize, and to a certain extent this is true. A person can be locked in a basement as a child and not let out of there. Then, if he has any predisposition to genius, if you keep him in the basement long enough, after a certain age, he will never realize what he has missed. But from a statistical point of view, such cases are irrelevant because they are rare in a haphazard way and change nothing in the general picture. Of course, a person could also be born a woman in the Middle Ages in some state with an absolute theocratic monarchy. But even in such cases, depending on their inclinations, people will try to realize themselves as much as they can. However, if we talk about modern free societies, it is ineffective to impose this or that environment on a person, because a person himself actively perceives, interprets, chooses, modifies, and even creates the environment corresponding to his genetic inclinations. Here's a prime example. Genetic differences in cognitive ability affect how a child will utilize their constitutionally granted right to an education. You can see how, during their time in school, almost everyone has had a subject that they ran for in leaps and bounds. There are children for whom all almost subjects look like this. They will absorb like a sponge everything they can. They will also read books and find hobbies that stimulate their cognitive development and choose friends that are similar to them genetically. By doing so, the person gets caught in a positive feedback loop where their experiences start to become more and more in line with who they are by nature. Thus, an interesting situation arises. We say that the heritability is on the order of 50%, but, as has been said, this is an average estimate that obscures how heritability changes over a lifetime. A consortium in a 2010 twin study that collected intelligence data from 11,000 pairs of twins from 4 countries showed that the inheritability of intelligence increases significantly from childhood to young adulthood, from 40% to 65%. A 2013 meta-analysis combined the results of all intelligence studies and confirmed the increase in heritability over the course of life. The few available studies of later life show that the increase in heritability continues throughout adulthood and reaches about 80% heritability at age 65. So if you're old enough, take your mind off the video and take a look at your life. Chances are, what you see is where the call of your ancestors has led you. But if you're not particularly thrilled with what you see, then maybe you're not living in a completely free society, because the fact that you've been listening to a story about genetics for half an hour probably says something good about your intelligence. The inheritability of intelligence will not lead to a caste system with the descendants of the elite at the top and ordinary people at the bottom. It doesn't work that way. Because the children of high IQ parents will, on average, have lower IQ scores than their parents. And for the same reason, most prodigies don't have prodigy parents and subsequently prodigy children. This is a statistical phenomenon. Because children are 50% genetically similar to their parents, genetics predicts that the average IQ of children will regress from their parents' IQ to the population average. For example, parents with an average IQ of 130 are expected to have children whose average IQ is 115. This reshuffling of DNA differences in the genetic lottery prevents the evolution of a rigid genetic caste system. On the other hand, parents of average intellectual ability give birth to children with a wide variation in intellectual ability, including high-ability children. Since there are many more parents of average ability than of high ability, this ensures that most of the people with the highest intelligence in the next generation will come from parents of average intelligence rather than high intelligence. So we're not facing a rigid caste system. We are in danger of something worse. Alexander Markov, Russian biologist, paleontologist, doctor of biological sciences, in his article, dated January 24, 2017, confirms Darwin's fears, which we talked about earlier. Markov writes that a new study, based on data on 110,000 Icelanders born between 1910 and 1975, has shown that genes associated with high levels of education and intelligence are indeed subject to negative selection. This is due to two mechanisms. First, because of a weakening of purifying selection against mutations that impair the functioning of certain organs and body systems, including the immune system and the brain. In the past, if a person's health was poor from birth, he rarely lived to childbearing age. Now, thanks to the development of medicine, almost everyone survives. And that's great, but the huge problem is that what makes us human is the brain, and it's very sensitive to mutations. The expression of a monstrous number of genes is involved in its development. Therefore, the breakage of some gene is very likely to affect the work of the brain, and not any other organ. In the past, such mutations reduced fitness and were therefore weeded out by selection. Now, however, these mutations are either less harmful in an evolutionary sense or generally harmless, but it would be unpleasant for each of us to have them, as they affect the quality of life. And these mutations began to accumulate freely in the gene pool. The second mechanism is negative selection for traits that help us succeed in life. Negative selection on those cognitive abilities and mental traits that we normally think of as virtues, namely determination, a desire for knowledge, the ability to plan one's life, and openness to new experiences. Such traits used to increase Darwinian fitness, but in modern society may have begun to decrease it. For example, as talented, educated, and economically successful people have begun to put off having children until later, skipping the most fertile age. I remind you that we are talking about statistics, and all of the above does not mean that if you have 3 children and did not graduate from college, you are an idiot. No, maybe you are, Bill Gates. But Markov says the situation with genetic degradation is only likely to gain momentum, and such research will soon be banned altogether due to its unethical nature. Society has become too vulnerable, and in the end, no one will benefit from it. As long as we consider ourselves a sentient species, we should do something about it. Given that all of humanity, I hope, despises Nazi Germany's experience with killing and sterilizing the unwanted, then we need to find a humane solution to the problem. For example, learn to determine phenotype from genotype, fix mutations manually, and maybe add something useful, thus taking evolution into our own hands. This is also unclear how it will end up because everything in our genome is in a very delicate balance. Improving something can have unpredictable consequences. For those who haven't realized yet, there is no intelligence gene. It is very rare for a single gene to be responsible for a single trait. Usually, many genes are responsible for each trait, and each gene affects many traits. For example, growth genes are distributed throughout the genome. A reasonable question is then, how do we find those genes that distinguish the intelligent from the shallow? Again, by using statistics. In other words, we can take 1,000 people with a certain disease and compare their genotypes with the genotypes of people without this disease. Then analyze the data and see where there are consistent differences. China, which doesn't always burden itself with ethical standards, recently conducted an experiment to create transgenic rhesus macaques with copies of the human gene, microcephaly. In humans, certain mutations in this gene result in microcephaly, a severe reduction in the size of the brain. Alterations in this gene are hypothesized to have played an important role in the evolution of the brain and cognitive abilities of primates in general and hominids in particular. Although the brains of the transgenic monkeys did not increase in size compared to normal macaques, they had improved short-term memory, and the development of the cortex showed certain features characteristic of human brain development. Transplanting just one gene will not make a monkey into a human. But what if the gene will be not 1, but 10, or say, 20, and we are already capable of realizing this? But do we have the right to do it? The year is 2012, 6 years to the point of no return. The journal Science publishes an article about the discovery of which Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna will receive the Nobel Prize in 2020. They have proposed an innovative system of gene editing called CRISPR-Cas9, which cheapened the process by 99% and accelerated it. Before 2012, genome editing was crazy expensive, time-consuming, and generally highly inefficient. Now, just about anyone with a lab can edit any segment of DNA in a cell. You can even buy yourself a kit online that has everything you need. You are probably listening to all this heredity stuff and wondering why children from the same parents are so different. One sibling may be extroverted, the other withdrawn, one may do better in school than the other, and so on. Genetics makes siblings 50% alike, but that means that for the other 50%, it makes them different. It was before genetics was taken seriously that it was a mystery why children who grew up in the same family with the same parents and attended the same school should sometimes be so different. For example, if one sibling is diagnosed with schizophrenia, the others have only a 9% risk of getting the disease. That is, of course, much higher than the 1% of the general population. But still, as for intelligence, siblings have a correlation of about 0.4. So from a psychological perspective, on the one hand, there is absolutely no problem in explaining why siblings are similar. People are a product of upbringing, and if a child is a jackass, it's always the parent's fault. However, on the other hand, given the presumed strength of the family environment, it has been very difficult for psychology to explain why siblings are so different. For example, the average difference in IQ scores between siblings is 13 points, which is not that far from the average difference of 17 points for pairs of people chosen at random. It wasn't until the 1970s that we began to realize that the similarity, as well as the dissimilarity of siblings, is mostly due to genes. Environment plays an important but smaller and unclear role. Think about it. You would be plus or minus the same as your brothers, sisters, and parents, even if you were adopted by another family as a child. And this is literally exactly what is comprehensively supported by studies, one of which lasted 10 years and resulted in the following. On average, at the age of 8, adopted siblings had a 0.25 correlation in intelligence scores with their non-adopted siblings. 10 years later, the same siblings had a correlation of 0. Again, we see that inheritability increases steadily from childhood to adulthood. Genetic studies of twins show that environmental influences are not only random and haphazard, but also largely unstable, that is, inconsistent over time. A twin who is happier today may be an unhappy twin tomorrow, and vice versa. Research has not demonstrated that differences between twins remain stable over several years, which is necessary if we claim that the environment has long-term consequences. In this sense, the systematic, stable, and long-lasting source of who we are is DNA. So if you want to find and understand yourself, it might be worthwhile to start by getting to know your relatives better, or even rebuilding your family tree. Some may say, what about when a parent may treat one child well and another child badly? It happens all the time. Doesn't that affect the way a child grows up? We have psychological studies showing a correlation between poor parental treatment and the development of depression in children. Please, here's a systemic predictor of environmental influences. How do you explain that? It's really awful. But where is the cause, and where is the effect? Why do parents treat, for example, one sister well and the other sister badly? Because they are genetically different. Robert Plomin is not saying that this is always the case, but differences in how negatively parents treat their children may be a consequence rather than a cause of the child's depression. One sister is smiley, responds well to her parents, and therefore gets positive feedback from them. The other sister is irritable and moody. After all, many character traits are sometimes evident from childhood. How can you even blame a child for the parent's poor treatment of him or her? Plomin himself was discouraged. He writes that upbringing and environment, of course, influence, but on everyone differently. And this influence is haphazard and completely unpredictable. Even among homozygous twins, there are those who have very different school performance, or one of them is more sociable, open-minded, or whatever. However, neither they nor their parents and relatives can explain the origins of this difference. In short, randomness. But randomness is not as simple as you might think. It is amazing how often biographies and autobiographies point to such accidents that determine the course of the rest of a person's life and the entire human race. Charles Darwin wrote in his autobiography that the most important event in his life, which determined his entire career, was a 5-year voyage on the Royal Navy expedition ship Beagle. This voyage would lead Darwin to his theory of evolution. And Darwin had no intention of seriously pursuing biology at all. This voyage hinged in retrospect on such minor circumstances as his uncle's offer to drive Charles 30 miles to the town of Shrewsbury, which few uncles would have done, and on such a trifle as the shape of Darwin's nose. The fact is that a Beagle captain named Robert Fitzroy, whom Darwin first met in Shrewsbury, almost refused Darwin the trip because Robert Fitzroy was a proponent of a doctrine that used the shape of the head to determine personality traits. Fitzroy was convinced that the shape of Darwin's nose indicated a lack of sufficient energy and determination in his character for such a wonder. Well, writes the author of The Theory of Evolution, during the voyage the officer became convinced that my nose was not telling the truth. Parents and upbringing do make a huge difference, even though differences in upbringing do not affect the psychological development of children. The relationship with parents is the most important relationship in a child's life. However, Plumman writes, children are not lumps of clay that can be molded at will. Also, aside from genetics, much of what happens to children is due to random events that parents have no control over. The good news is that this doesn't matter much in the long run, because, recall, the influence of experience is not stable over time. After difficult events such as parental divorce, moving, and loss of friends, some children get back to normal sooner, some later, but eventually they all revert to their genetic trajectory. You can, of course, take a different path. You can try to make your child a perfect version of yourself, try to impose your dreams on your children, such as having them become math geniuses, world-class musicians, or sports stars. But you are unlikely to have much success if you are not guided by the genetic aspect. If you go against the rules, you risk ruining the relationship with your children, which happens all the time. Instead of trying to mold your kids in your own image, you can help them figure out what they like to do and what they are good at. Because people often really like to do what they are good at. Of course, this is not about letting your kids do whatever they want, turning a blind eye to all discipline. No, it's about something else. You should be satisfied that your children are 50% copies of you. And you should accept that the other 50% of them are not like you. By realizing this, you can help them become who they are. Robert Plumman writes, I hope this is a liberating message that should relieve parents of the anxiety and guilt heaped on them by parent-blaming socialization theories and practical parenting advice books. These theories and books can scare you into thinking that one wrong move can ruin a child forever. Plumman also writes about tolerance for others and for ourselves in the context of the enormous influence of genetics on individual differences. He also says that DNA is not a reason to give up trying to change, and certainly not an excuse for one's weaknesses. Genes are not destiny. Erwin Schrödinger, the greatest physicist of all time, was deeply interested in philosophy and was influenced by the works of Schopenhauer and Spinoza. Schopenhauer's works also introduced him to Indian philosophy. In his book, What is Life?, Schrödinger ends with a chapter on determinism and free will. In general, most of us are rather ill-informed as to the extent to which many great physicists like to speculate in metaphysical categories, so listen carefully to this passage. Schrödinger writes, all spatiotemporal events in the body of a living being are, if not strictly predetermined, then statistically predetermined. Let us therefore try to draw a correct, consistent conclusion from two premises. My body functions as a pure mechanism according to the laws of nature. And yet I know from irrefutable direct experience that I direct its movements, the consequences of which I foresee. And in the event that they prove fatal and extremely important, I assume full responsibility for them. It seems to me that the only possible conclusion from these two factors is that I am me in the widest sense of the word. That is, every conscious mind that has ever said I or felt itself to be me. The self controls the movement of atoms according to the laws of nature. For centuries, mystics have independently, yet in perfect harmony with each other, described personal experiences in words that can be summarized in the phrase Deus factus sum. I have become God. November 26, 2018, a day after which the world will never be the same again. A newly registered and unknown to no one YouTube channel publishes this video. In it, a man in a sky blue shirt declares that two twin girls, Lulu and Nana, were born perfectly healthy. The man in the video is He Jiankui, a Chinese biologist and biophysicist, and Lulu and Nana are the world's first genetically modified humans. They are supposedly immune to HIV, which was diagnosed in their father. The genetic modification was accomplished using CRISPR-Cas9 technology. The experiment was conducted in secret until November 2018. He Jiankui announced his experiment not with the help of a publication in a scientific journal, but literally in this very YouTube video you have in front of you. It was thanks to this video that the whole world learned that the process of evolution that lasted naturally for 4 billion years was interfered with. Not by artificial selection and breeding, but at the most fundamental level, by consciously and directly manipulating the language of nature that makes us who we are. DNA sequences that have been slowly formed over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years can now be changed instantaneously. YouTube is not available in China. Jiankui's message was addressed to the Western world. The news immediately traveled around the planet, causing fury in the scientific community. A month later, the journal Nature will include He Jiankui in the top 10 people of the year, but as an anti-hero, calling him the crisp rogue. The university where he worked immediately disavowed the project, and Chinese authorities will launch an investigation. Subsequently, He Jiankui will receive 3 years in prison and a fine of 3 million yuan. However, the main mystery will remain unsolved. Why Jiankui chose the so far dangerous and unpredictable technology of gene modification when there are other proven methods of HIV prevention. Besides, with modern methods, even HIV-infected mothers give birth to HIV-negative children in more than 90% of cases, and from HIV-infected fathers in general in almost 100%. So, the experiment was also pointless. Why in the end? Since he decided on such a risky venture, he chose for the experiment to protect against HIV, with which people can live normally until old age. After all, there are a lot of hereditary diseases, for the appearance of which is responsible for a single gene, and from which, unlike HIV, people die in 100% of cases. For example, Huntington's disease. It causes the death of neurons and the gradual destruction of the brain. We have some reasonable suspicions. Despite the fact that in his YouTube address, He Jiankui only advocates a cure and that he's against genetic enhancement of humans. It is the gene mutation associated with his HIV immunity that, according to research, has also been linked to dramatic increases in cognitive ability, improved memory, and faster recovery from stroke. There's more. The news website Stat News said it has documents that He Jiankui not conduct these experiments illegally, but on behalf of the Chinese government and with public money, and that the Chinese authorities used him to remove all suspicions of complicity before the world community. This version seems at the very least bizarre. But you can't even imagine the amount of benefits in all areas that would potentially accrue to countries secretly or explicitly conducting immoral genetic experiments. You just can't imagine it. Shortly after the Jiankui incident, one of the creators of the technology, Jennifer Doudna, in response to a reporter's question about whether there should be a moratorium on editing human embryos, replied, "It's too late. What does all this mean for our future? What will be the consequences of human genetic modification, which has already begun? And no ethics committee will stop it, and all genetic changes will be hereditary."